My name is Dr. Aisha Rahman, and I'm writing this from my office at a prestigious research university where I'm an assistant professor with a PhD from MIT, postdoctoral training at Stanford, 15 peer-reviewed publications, 2 major research grants, and teaching awards. Credentials that should make me confident in my qualifications but instead coexist with paralyzing belief that I'm a fraud who somehow fooled everyone, that I don't actually deserve to be here, that I'm fundamentally less capable than my white colleagues despite evidence to the contrary, and that eventually I'll be exposed as imposter who doesn't belong in elite academic spaces. At 33, I've achieved everything I worked toward: prestigious education, competitive faculty position, research success, student admiration, but I experience it all through lens of chronic self-doubt, attributing successes to luck or others' generosity rather than my abilities, obsessively over-preparing because I believe I'm less competent, sabotaging opportunities because I'm terrified of failure that would confirm my secret inadequacy, and living with constant anxiety that the truth about my fraudulence will eventually be discovered and everything will collapse. The imposter syndrome origins trace back to being working-class Bangladeshi American student from immigrant family attending elite institutions where I was always the only South Asian woman in my physics program at MIT, one of few women of color in my graduate cohort, and now one of limited number of South Asian women faculty in my field nationally. The isolation and hypervisibility created conditions where every mistake felt magnified, every success felt like anomaly rather than pattern, and the message that I didn't belong was communicated through countless microaggressions, surprised reactions to my competence, and the absence of people who looked like me in positions of authority. The attribution errors began early in my academic career when I started systematically attributing successes to external factors. I got into MIT because of diversity initiatives rather than my exceptional test scores and grades. I received fellowships because committees wanted to support women of color rather than because my research proposals were strong. My publications were accepted because reviewers were being generous rather than because my research met rigorous standards. The pattern of attributing success to anything except my own abilities meant that no achievement could actually build confidence or prove competence because I had explanations for why each success didn't count as evidence of my capabilities. The preparation obsession developed as coping mechanism where I would over-prepare for everything, spending weeks preparing for lectures that white colleagues prepared in days, rehearsing presentations dozens of times while others seemed to present effortlessly, and generally working far harder than necessary because I believed I was starting from position of deficit compared to colleagues who belonged in ways I didn't. The over-preparation was exhausting and unsustainable but felt necessary to compensate for the inadequacy I was certain I possessed. The comparison trap was constant as I measured myself against colleagues and consistently concluded they were more naturally talented, better prepared by their educational backgrounds, more confident in ways that reflected genuine competence rather than the fake confidence I performed. I couldn't see that my assessment was biased by imposter syndrome and that objective measures of productivity and quality showed I was performing at or above the level of peers I was convinced outclassed me. The opportunity sabotage happened when I would avoid applying for competitive opportunities, decline invitations to present my work at prestigious venues, or turn down leadership positions because I was convinced I would fail and the failure would expose my fraudulence. The self-sabotage meant I was limiting my own career advancement not because I lacked ability but because I couldn't trust that my achievements reflected real competence deserving recognition and advancement. The perfectionism paralysis made everything harder as I set impossibly high standards for my work and interpreted anything less than perfection as evidence of my inadequacy. A single critical comment on a manuscript would overshadow 10 positive reviews and confirm my belief that my work wasn't really good enough. A student complaint would devastate me in ways that seemed disproportionate to colleagues who could contextualize occasional negative feedback as inevitable rather than as evidence of fundamental inadequacy. The stereotype threat activation happened constantly as I was hyper-aware that my performance was being viewed through lens of racist and sexist stereotypes about South Asian women, women in STEM, and minorities in academia. The awareness that I might confirm stereotypes if I performed poorly created additional pressure that interfered with actual performance, creating self-fulfilling prophecy where anxiety about proving stereotypes impaired the performance that would disprove them. The isolation intensification resulted from lack of mentors and peers who shared my identity and could provide modeling of successful South Asian women in my field who felt confident and deserving. The absence of representation meant I had no proof that someone like me could belong in elite academic spaces, and the isolation meant I had no one to talk to about the specific experiences of being the only one who could validate that the self-doubt I experienced was response to systemic factors rather than accurate assessment of my abilities. The microaggression accumulation created constant evidence that I didn't fully belong, colleagues expressing surprise at my credentials, students challenging my authority in ways they didn't challenge white male professors, being mistaken for administrative staff rather than faculty, having my research questions and contributions overlooked in meetings, and experiencing countless small indignities that communicated I was outsider who didn't naturally belong in academic spaces. Each microaggression reinforced imposter syndrome by confirming that others also saw me as not quite belonging. The visibility burden meant that as the only one, I was simultaneously hypervisible, my presence always notable, my mistakes more memorable, my successes more likely to be attributed to diversity rather than merit, and invisible in ways that mattered, with my scholarly contributions overlooked, my expertise underestimated, and my leadership potential not recognized. The contradictory experience of being too visible and not visible enough reinforced sense that I didn't fit in ways that white colleagues did. The mental health deterioration included anxiety attacks before presentations despite years of successful teaching, insomnia from worrying about work performance, and depression related to chronic self-doubt and sense that I was living fraudulent existence. The imposter syndrome wasn't just occasional self-doubt but pervasive pattern that affected every aspect of my professional life and was beginning to affect my physical health through stress-related symptoms. The family pressure added complexity as my immigrant parents viewed my academic success as vindication of their sacrifices and had no framework for understanding why I felt like fraud despite achieving more than they had imagined possible. When I tried to express my self-doubt, they responded with confusion and suggestions that I was being ungrateful or paranoid, unable to understand how systemic racism created imposter syndrome in high-achieving minorities who internalized messages that they didn't deserve their success. The relationship impact affected my personal life as romantic partners struggled to understand my chronic anxiety about work, my inability to celebrate achievements, and my constant conviction that I was about to be exposed as fraud and lose everything. The imposter syndrome made me difficult to be close to because I couldn't accept reassurance or believe positive feedback, always finding evidence that supported my negative self-assessment while dismissing evidence of my competence. The breaking point came when I was awarded a prestigious national fellowship recognizing my research contributions, and instead of feeling proud I had full panic attack convinced that the selection committee had made terrible mistake, that I didn't deserve the recognition, that I would disappoint them when they realized I wasn't as accomplished as they thought, and that the fellowship would expose my fraudulence to broader academic community. The response to achievement with panic rather than pride made clear that imposter syndrome had reached crisis level requiring intervention. The therapy that helped me address imposter syndrome was with Dr. Priya Patel, a South Asian American psychologist who specialized in treating high-achieving women of color and understood that my imposter syndrome wasn't individual pathology but predictable response to being minority in spaces where subtle and overt messages communicated that I didn't belong. She helped me understand that chronic self-doubt despite objective evidence of competence was a phenomenon called imposter syndrome that disproportionately affected minorities in elite spaces. Imposter syndrome in minorities isn't just psychological phenomenon but is response to real systemic barriers and messages that you don't belong, Dr. Patel explained during one of our sessions. When you're the only one, when you face microaggressions questioning your competence, when you see absence of people like you in leadership, when your successes are attributed to diversity rather than merit, when you face stereotype threat that creates anxiety about confirming negative expectations, all of these factors create rational basis for self-doubt even when objective evidence shows you're highly competent. The problem isn't your perception but the systems that create conditions where minorities can't trust their own achievements. She helped me distinguish between healthy self-reflection about areas for growth and the pathological self-doubt that characterized imposter syndrome, learn to recognize cognitive distortions in how I interpreted evidence about my competence, and develop strategies for managing anxiety while building more accurate self-assessment that incorporated objective evidence of my abilities rather than dismissing all positive data. The cognitive restructuring work involved learning to identify and challenge the automatic thoughts that maintained imposter syndrome, noticing when I attributed success to luck rather than ability, when I catastrophized about potential failure, when I interpreted neutral events as evidence of inadequacy, and when I held myself to different and higher standards than I applied to colleagues. The work wasn't about becoming arrogant but about developing realistic self-assessment that acknowledged both strengths and areas for growth. The evidence-gathering assignment from Dr. Patel involved documenting objective evidence of my competence, collecting positive teaching evaluations, publication acceptance letters, grant awards, colleague and student testimonials, and other concrete proof that my success reflected real abilities rather than accident or diversity preferences. Reviewing accumulated evidence helped counter the automatic dismissal of achievements and provided concrete reference when self-doubt emerged. The mentorship connection that Dr. Patel encouraged involved seeking out successful women of color in academia who could model that someone like me could belong and thrive in elite spaces. Finding mentors who had navigated similar self-doubt and succeeded despite it provided both practical strategies and existence proof that imposter syndrome could be managed and that I wasn't uniquely fraudulent but was experiencing common response to systemic barriers. The community building with other women of color faculty through organizations like the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity created space to discuss imposter syndrome openly and discover that my experiences were widely shared among minority faculty. The collective validation that we were all experiencing similar self-doubt despite strong credentials helped denormalize the feelings and recognize them as products of systemic racism rather than accurate assessments of our abilities. The self-compassion practice that Dr. Patel taught involved treating myself with the same kindness and understanding I would extend to mentor a friend experiencing self-doubt, recognizing that perfectionism and harsh self-criticism were maintaining imposter syndrome rather than protecting me from failure. The practice included acknowledging that making mistakes was normal part of learning and growth rather than evidence of fundamental inadequacy. The boundary setting around perfectionism involved deliberately allowing good enough work rather than always striving for perfect. Recognizing that my obsessive overpreparation was unsustainable coping mechanism that maintained belief I needed to work harder than others to compensate for deficiency that didn't actually exist. Learning to prepare appropriately rather than excessively was both practical time management and challenge to the belief system underlying imposter syndrome. The achievement celebration practice involved deliberately acknowledging and celebrating successes rather than immediately dismissing them or moving to next goal. Dr. Patel helped me understand that inability to feel proud of achievements maintained imposter syndrome by preventing positive experiences from building confidence, and that learning to actually experience pride was an important part of developing healthy relationship with my accomplishments. The advocacy work that emerged from my experience includes speaking openly about imposter syndrome in academic settings, helping institutions understand how they create conditions that produce imposter syndrome in minorities, and mentoring junior faculty and graduate students of color who are experiencing similar self-doubt. The work transforms personal struggle into collective action while also reinforcing my own recovery by helping others validate their experiences and develop strategies I learned. The research engagement studying imposter syndrome in minorities documents patterns and contributing factors, providing empirical evidence that validates experiential knowledge. The research shows that minorities in elite spaces experience significantly higher rates of imposter syndrome than majority group members, and that structural factors including stereotype threat, isolation, and microaggressions contribute to the phenomenon. Today, I still experience moments of self-doubt and anxiety about my competence, but I have tools for managing these experiences rather than letting them dominate my professional life and limit my opportunities. I can recognize imposter syndrome when it emerges and can challenge the distorted thinking rather than accepting it as truth. The work is ongoing rather than complete resolution, but the quality of my professional life has improved dramatically since addressing imposter syndrome directly. The next generation focus includes changing systems that create imposter syndrome by increasing representation, addressing microaggressions, providing mentorship, and creating explicit conversations about imposter syndrome so that future minorities in elite spaces have context for understanding their self-doubt as systemic response rather than individual inadequacy. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with culturally competent providers who understand imposter syndrome in minorities helps address root causes rather than treating it as individual pathology. Mentorship from successful people who share identity provides modeling and validation that someone like you can belong and succeed in elite spaces. Community building with others who share experiences creates space for discussing imposter syndrome openly and recognizing it as common response to systemic factors. Cognitive restructuring challenges distorted thinking patterns that maintain imposter syndrome and builds more accurate self-assessment incorporating objective evidence. Documentation of achievements provides concrete evidence countering automatic dismissal of success and supports more realistic self-evaluation. Self-compassion practice treats yourself with kindness rather than harsh criticism that maintains imposter syndrome through perfectionism and fear of failure. Boundary setting around perfectionism allows good enough work rather than unsustainable overpreparation that reinforces belief you're starting from deficit. Institutional change addressing representation, microaggressions, and mentorship reduces systemic factors that create imposter syndrome in minorities. Today, when I feel like fraud despite my MIT PhD and strong publication record, I can recognize imposter syndrome as response to systemic factors rather than accurate assessment of my abilities. I can challenge distorted thinking with evidence, and I can extend myself the compassion I would offer to others experiencing similar self-doubt. Imposter syndrome is real and painful, but it's not truth about my competence. It's artifact of being minority in spaces that weren't designed for people like me and that communicate in countless ways that I don't belong despite objective evidence that I've earned my place through exceptional work.